Hello and welcome to the Reformation Red Pill podcast. I am your host, Joshua Hames, and today, as you guys well know, we have a very special episode coming at you guys. Today, we are going to be discussing a rather important topic, a controversial topic in many ways. The question, should conservatives support the modern nation state of Israel? Today, I have the pleasure of hosting this discussion on one of the more hot button pressing issues within American conservatism at the moment. And I've got two very influential men, very important guests that I'm going to introduce to you guys. And for those of you, I haven't had them on my show before, so I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. Here we've got Dinesh D'Souza and Auron MacIntyre. Welcome to the program. I'm going to give it over to you first, Dinesh, if you could. Introduce yourself to my audience. Who are you? What do you do? And how can people find you and your work?
Well, I'm a writer, a filmmaker. I do a daily podcast, the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. I came of age politically in the Reagan years, worked briefly in my 20s in the Reagan White House. I've been much of my career in conservative think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution. And in the last decade or so, I've been making documentary films, the latest of which is called The Dragon's Prophecy. And as it turns out, it's on these topics. In other words, it covers Israel, Hamas, anti-Semitism, radical Islam, but also biblical archaeology and a hint of biblical prophecy. So if I can mention the website, it is thedragonsprophecyfilm.com. It's films in theaters for a couple of days, October 6th and 8th, and then it's in streaming and DVD.
Excellent. Thank you. And over to you, Auron MacIntyre. Who are you? What do you do? And how can people find you and your work?
I'm an author, and I write and host a show over on Blaze TV. I also came of age politically reading books like Dinesh's. So always fun to have discussions like this. Thanks for having me.
That's great. I noticed that neither of you got raptured, which is really great because I was worried that this wasn't going to work out for that very reason. But you're both left behind like me, so we can work this stuff out in real time. So I noticed. All right, let me frame this discussion here for us. I brought both of you on kind of selfishly because I've been working through this issue on whether or not Christian conservatives should support the modern nation state of Israel. I've been thinking through it. I'm not a dispensationalist, so I don't believe that the Jews are God's chosen people. That's not going to be our debate or discussion for today. I'm really interested in. So this is really started as a Reformed theology podcast. So we're covenantal. We believe that the modern people of God are made of Jews and Gentiles. It's the church. But we're not trying to necessarily get into the theological element today. I'm actually very interested in the kind of realpolitik, geopolitical reasons for why Christian conservatives should or should not support the modern nation of Israel. Now, that being said, if either of you bring in the theological reasoning into the discussion, happy to have that. I'm just giving a little bit of the framing for what I'm interested in and what I'm trying to get at today. Because I haven't been convinced either way. Like I really could be convinced that it is in America's best interest to support the modern nation state of Israel, or it might not be. And so that's kind of why I brought you both on. But before I get into our first question, which is really just, should we support the modern nation of Israel? I want to ask both of you guys a question. I consider myself a Christian nationalist, and I want to know how would you identify yourself as a Christian nationalist? Matt Walsh kind of came out and waved that banner the other day. Dinesh, I'll start with you. What do you think of the term Christian nationalism? Do you consider yourself a Christian nationalist?
In general, I'm pretty comfortable with that label. I wouldn't take it all the way. And here's what I mean. I'm a Christian nationalist in the sense that I'm both a Christian and a patriot. I'm certainly America first, but I don't understand America first to mean America alone or America only. This, I think, is going to be key for our discussion. The term Christian nationalist, I think, is a little, and nationalist becomes the noun. That would have seemed to imply that nationalism is primary and Christian serves nationalism. I think it's actually the other way around. And by that, I mean, if it ever comes down to a choice between my country and my Christianity, I'm going to have to go with the Christianity. So
Amen.
for that reason, I can't fully endorse the idea of Christian nationalism, although I'm in a colloquial sense very comfortable with it. I occupy both those terms very well.
Okay, interesting. What about you, Auron?
I've said this many times. I think the problem with the Christian nationalist title is that it's a leftist trap rhetorically. I agree with Christianity and I agree with nationalism. And so to that extent, yes, I follow the objectives, I guess, of many Christian nationalists. But ultimately, I think that embracing the term is a problem. I also think that it limits the discussion on nationalism because, of course, Ethiopia is a Christian nation. There are many Christian nations, but America is its own thing. I'm an American nationalist. That, of course, involves Christianity because America is founded in Christianity. But I feel like the term Christian nationalist is actually a little too broad and a little rhetorically sloppy. But ultimately, I would not, probably disagree with of course, the idea that we should have laws completely informed by our Christian faith in the United States.
Good. Oh, that's great. I mean, it seems like we're getting down to the first principles there. It seems like we agree on generally speaking on what we're pursuing there. That's great. Yeah. All right. So I'll just start with you, Dinesh. Very simply, why do you believe that Christian conservatives should support the modern nation state of Israel?
Well, I think the reasons are biblical, they are moral, and they are practical. So those are three broad categories, and they're all quite different. And in some cases where America has an allegiance or an alliance, you have the moral case may work in your favor, but then the practicality doesn't work. I think in the case of Israel, the biblical case is strong, the moral case is strong, and the practical case is strong. So let's kind of go through those very briefly. The biblical case is not merely that, quote, God gave the land to Abraham. That's part of it. But it really is more than that. It is the idea that Israel is the spiritual root of Christianity and of Western civilization. We often talk, the philosopher Leo Strauss spoke of Western civilization as having its root in Athens and Jerusalem. And Athens is very easy to defend. Athens is Socrates and philosophy and the Greek theater and the origins of democracy with Pericles and so on. But Jerusalem is controversial because Jerusalem is Abraham and the Bible. It's the Ten Commandments and the Hebrew prophets. It's Jesus and Messiah. So Western civilization is really inconceivable without either of those two basic roots. It's kind of like a two-legged stool. You cut off one leg and basically the stool is going to fall down. So the point here isn't just that Israel has rights, which of course it does. It's that we are spiritually engrafted as Christians onto Israel. That to me is loosely the biblical case. Then you have a moral case, which is that Israel as a nation reflects our moral values. And by the moral values here, I'm talking about the moral values that informed the founding of America. The idea of representative democracy, the idea of an ensemble of basic freedoms, the idea of having minorities, religious minorities, racial minorities, be part of your society and having rights in your society. Israel resembles us in that respect. And it certainly does so to a vastly greater degree than any of its hostile neighbors, and certainly the people that Israel is fighting against. But the third case, which is the practical case, the realpolitik case, to me is the strongest. And the most important. And that's the case that nation states should pay attention to. Let's remember that the world is a very dangerous place. And it is full of hostile gangs that are heavily armed and in some cases informed by radical ideologies that declare us, by us here, I mean the United States of America and the West in general, to be their sworn enemies, and they are dedicated to our destruction. Now, this agenda does not come from Israel. When Hassan al-Banna started the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 1920s, he was utterly indifferent to Israel. His argument was something entirely different. It was something more like this. Islam used to rule the world a half millennium ago, and now look at the disgraced state of Islamic regions and states. They're governed by pro-Western despots for the most part, and Islam is sort of the laughingstock of the world. And he said, why is this? Well, the answer is, he says, we're not really following true Islam. We need the force of Islam's original revelation. We need to mobilize the way the armies of Muhammad did. We maybe need to do that in a new way, using both conquest and infiltration of Western societies. So you have this worldwide project undertaken by the radical Muslims, and they're doing it right now by taking over cities in London. They're infiltrating cities in the United States. And this is way beyond the Palestinians or Hamas. We have massive states like Iran and Turkey that are part of this project. They are, of course, abetted by countries like China and Russia. So you have this hostile alliance, this sort of axis of hostility, if you want to call it that. And that's the reality of the world. So a country like the United States in that environment has got to ask, what friends do we have in the world that are going to help us to defeat and block and thwart this axis? And it's not just about Israel. Let's look, for example, at the rising power of China. Doesn't it make sense for the United States to find allies in places like Japan and Korea and India? Yes. Why? Because they are in that neighborhood. They are powerful countries unto themselves, and they are capable, certainly together, of helping us to block the growing power of China. Similarly, in the Middle East, we have one country that happens to share our values. By the way, when we're talking about countries like India and South Korea, they may share our values to a much lesser degree, but nevertheless, they are realpolitik allies. Whereas with Israel, we have a country that is in many ways a lot like us, with the same spiritual and moral root, and they happen to be really tough. Israel has shown that basically single-handedly they can whip pretty much the Arab world combined. A country of 10 or 12 million. Let's look at Iran, which has about 80 million. Israel has shown that it can take on Iran. Israel is on the front line of our battle against radical Islam. Now, let me just wrap up, because I don't want to take too much time with this, in saying that we, the United States, have demonstrated our incapacity, our inability, our incompetence in fighting radical Islam. First of all, we helped to create it. Jimmy Carter pulled out the rug from the Shah of Iran, and that's how we got Khomeini. That's how radical Islam got a hold of its first major state. Then we didn't see 9/11 coming despite all the signs. When 9/11 came, what did we do? We went over to Afghanistan, we clobbered the Taliban, chased them out of there, but guess what? They're back. So that project has turned out to be a failure. And then we go to Iraq in a major democracy building adventure. We botched the whole operation. We forget that Iraq is Shia, just like Iran. The Iranians outwit us. Basically, the Shia are back in control. Iraq has slipped out of our hands. And so we have a kind of almost uncheckered record of failure in fighting radical Islam. Israel, by contrast, has an almost uncheckered record of success. They are our ass kickers in the Middle East, and they really know how to do it. They have utterly crippled Hamas. They have taken on radical Islam in the whole region, and they have done it in such a clever way that they have even allowed Arab countries like Jordan, like Saudi Arabia, to form, you can say, working relationships with Israel. Why? Because as it turns out, even those countries don't like radical Islam. So this is not, I want to emphasize this is not just about going up against the Muslims. We're going up against radical Islam. The radical Muslims, by the way, understand the connection between Israel and America. That's why they use the term little Satan. We're the great Satan. And that right there tells you we are the ultimate target. So my point is Israel is doing at a minimal cost to us the job that we should be doing, but don't know how to do. And so it's really smart, in my opinion, for us to ally with Israel and allow them to do something that's good for them, but it's even better for us.
So, in a sense, you could say that that Israel is almost the front lines of defense in a way against radical Islam, and they're essentially taking a lot of the bullets that we might otherwise take. Is in summary.
Yeah, not even the front line of defense. In some cases, the front line of aggression, because when you have an enemy, you sometimes want to take the battle to their camp, and Israel is willing to do that. Now, I agree. After October 7th, Israel's action was retaliatory. It was defensive in that sense, just like you could say America's action in World War II was defensive once we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. But we took the battle into the enemy camp. We inflicted far more civilian casualties than Japan had inflicted on Pearl Harbor. Nobody questions, as far as I can tell, the morality of that enterprise. The only debate is, should we have dropped the atomic bomb on those guys, or should we have done a land invasion of Japan, which would have caused untold casualties? But either way, the underlying moral principle is they started it, and so we get to go over there and end it. And somehow with Israel now, there's a change of standards. Suddenly it's like, oh, Israel can't do that, even though Israel was sitting pretty, doing its own thing when Hamas launched an unprovoked attack.
That's something, Auron, once after you give kind of your introductory statements here on whether or not we should support Israel, that's something I'd like you to address, because that's something I often hear, right, is the nature of their retaliation is somehow beyond the pale. And I hear that a lot in both left and right, conservative and liberal circles. And so that's interesting. You're drawing the analogy between Pearl Harbor and I'm wondering if there is another standard that they're being held to or not. So I'd like you to get to that. But before you get to that, Auron, if you could just give us kind of your basic introduction, like why or why not should we support the modern nation of Israel?
Sure. So I guess to echo some of Dinesh's format there, the first question, I guess, is are we biblically commanded or biblically required to support the modern secular government of Benjamin Netanyahu? And my answer is no. I don't believe that the Bible requires us to do so, but that gets into issues of theology. Like you said, we're not going to be focusing on that. So we'll just say we have a difference there on a theological basis of whether the Bible mandates us to see the current Jewish state as the instantiation of some people we owe an allegiance to because of our roots in Christianity. Of course, Christianity has a history in Judaism, but they are distinct faiths. They are not the same, and I don't think that we are in any way required to see Judaism as some essential part of our faith that we must go out and defend in the modern political order. I want to wrap a little bit of my moral and practical arguments in the same argument. And sorry, I don't want to be pretentious here, but I'm just going to read a little bit of George Washington's farewell address, because this is literally just what I'm basing my idea of what our American foreign policy should be, because I think our founding fathers knew what they were talking about. And I think having the very first president of the United States lay out exactly what he believed our foreign policy vision should be as a constitutional republic is pretty important. So he says, in the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than the permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duties and interests. Antipathy to one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes or umbrages, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Then he goes to what the problems with actual being overattached. He says, so likewise a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favored nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where there is no real common interest that exists, and infusing into the enmities of others betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without an adequate inducement of or justification. He also goes on to explain that this favored nation status will create factions inside of the country, that different political parties will form around the idea of whether they are pro or against this favored nation. This will also, he says very specifically, again, this is his words, not mine, invite foreign influence into the nation. People will see themselves as either more American or less American based on their willingness to support that nation and not their actual care for their own nation. And so he says we should just never, ever treat a nation as if it is our favored ally, our special ally, our eternal ally. These things are all huge mistakes because ultimately they will drive division and they will give foreign interests the ability to wedge into our politics and drive us apart. He also warns repeatedly that this is going to make people identify an attack on or criticism of the favored nation as an attack on America itself. And this is very dangerous because if you're not able to criticize foreign governments without being seen as unpatriotic or un-American, which we have heard very, very often, unfortunately, from very many pro-Israel commentators, then that means you are basically tying your patriotism to support of another government you do not control, which is extremely dangerous. So I think the point here is, I don't think we should hate Israel. The people who loathe Israel make their entire lives about hating Israel. It's all Israel. It's all the Jews, whatever. That's exactly against what George Washington said to do. But so is being obsessed with Israel in the positive sense. They're our greatest ally. We have people like Ted Cruz saying, I got into the Senate to become Israel's greatest champion. We have people like Tammy Bruce, who are working for the administration, saying, well, America is the second best country next to Israel. It's very clear that George Washington's warning to us has manifested very obviously in our society. And finally, I'll just say, to the point that Dinesh was saying, practically when it comes to, well, Israel's just better at this stuff than us. Well, two things about that. One, kind of, they're in the region, so they're more familiar. I trust that they have a better understanding of the dynamics, but they make all of these actions with us behind them. It's like saying, okay, well, this 5'5" guy is really good at fighting as long as he's got Andre the Giant standing right behind him. That's true. Israel is capable. They are a capable military nation. But behind all of that is the idea that the greatest superpower in the world is standing there to ensure that if things ever really get out of hand, we can come in and manage that situation for them. And everybody knows this. There's a reason that we move our aircraft carriers into position the minute Israel is going to take action. And finally, Machiavelli told us that ultimately the prince who wins victories under the arms of another has won no victory at all. If you cannot win the victory on your own under your own arms, then you have become dependent on another power. You have lost sovereignty. So I don't mean this in the sense of Israel tells us everything that we need to do, though I think they do have far more influence than they should in the United States. But I mean this in the sense of if we are entirely dependent on another nation for a critical part of our military operation, we are de facto handing sovereignty over to that nation. Again, this is not some, rumination on our current political environment. This is an eternal truth of politics from some of our most critical political theorists. So I think at the end of the day, if we need a capacity to go into the Middle East, and, a lot of this is we don't actually have to do that. The whole idea of we go over there and fight them there so they don't come over here has failed entirely because, large chunks of America are now turning Muslim. We have city councils in Dearborn, Michigan, telling Christian pastors to go pound sand because they're going to blast the call to prayer over the loudspeakers as much as they want. And you're not welcome here, white Christian man, in your own country. Same thing happening in Texas. We have, Muslim only cities setting up there. I don't think this strategy has been particularly good, actually, at stopping what seems to be the inevitable Islamatization of parts of the United States. There are solutions for that problem, and none of them have anything with us going over to the Middle East. In fact, us going over to the Middle East probably exacerbated that problem more than it solved it. So ultimately, I think if we need to develop the capacity to fight in the Middle East at all, we should develop the capacity. We shouldn't be reliant on Israel for intelligence or military or anything else, because ultimately we should have our own nation first. Again, this is the whole point of George Washington's farewell address. He says a nation that is so blessed by God to have this level of, in his own words, isolation from the rest of the world. We don't have to interact with Europe. We don't have to interact with the old world. We don't have to be dependent on these other powers. We should see that as a blessing, and we should take that blessing and then become our own powerful, independent nation. I just don't see why we're going to go back on that and become dependent on another nation when our founders told us very specifically, don't do that, because it'll have exactly the effect that is now happening in our own country today.
Very good. Well, thank you for that, Auron. Before I pass it over back to Dinesh, would you consider yourself an isolationist?
I mean, that term is obviously itself a loaded one.
Yeah.
I would say that if I was going to say this, I guess realist is the term that people don't like now for foreign policy, but I think that is a more accurate understanding. Ultimately, I think one of the problems America is facing is after World War II, we basically conquered the world. And as the world hegemon, we've had ups and downs, and we've benefited from empire, and we've paid the costs of empire. But ultimately, I wrote a book about this, The Total State. I think that scale is actually become a problem in the modern world, and that if we continue to try to operate a global empire in the way that we have, we will pay a cost. And so I would like to see us scale down that empire. That doesn't mean that if there is not a legitimate war that we need to fight, I'm not a pacifist. I know that war is part of statecraft and a reality of human existence. So I'm not anti-war in some libertarian abstract sense, but I just don't think that the maintenance of empire is worth the American blood and treasure at this point. We have far too many problems at home, and that's where we should focus whenever possible.
That's good. Oh, I have so many questions from that. But before I get to that, I want to pass it back over to you, Dinesh, because I've been listening to you, Auron, for a little while now, and I think I first heard that George Washington address from you, and that's pretty powerful for me in shaping my own views on foreign policy as I'm shaping them. So, Dinesh, I'd like to hear you respond to some of the claims that Auron was making, especially with regard to our very first president and his views on foreign policy. So I'll pass it over to you, Dinesh.
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation because our disagreements are more at the granular level and not, I think, on sort of fundamental principle. I mean, my admiration for George Washington borders on the devotional. So I'm going to start by saying our areas of agreement. I think that helps to sharpen where we disagree. So Washington says, number one, that we don't have any permanent friends or enemies. Countries can be friendly to us on this matter and then turn against us on that matter. And I agree with that. I'm not suggesting that we have some joined at the hip relationship with Israel where no matter what they do, let's just say, for example, that Israel decided to become hypothetically a fascist dictatorship tomorrow. I'm not saying that our position to them should remain unchanged because, hey, they're still the nation of Israel and Athens and Jerusalem and all that. No. Similarly, we have other friends in the world, right? We have both a historical and a kind of moral alliance with Great Britain. America came out of Great Britain. Of course, we had to fight a revolution against them, but we remain closer to Great Britain even now than we are even to other Europeans, let alone to countries like, for example, the Congo or Papua New Guinea, with whom we have much less in common. So this is, in fact, the architecture of the world. Now, when America was founded, America was sort of like the infant on the playground with lots of big bullies running around. And George Washington, very shrewdly, and taking a cue from Machiavelli, developed a foreign policy appropriate to that situation, right? When everybody else is bigger and stronger than you are, you don't really want to go around picking fights in the playground because you're going to get clobbered. In fact, George Washington himself would have gotten clobbered had the British fought him the way they fought Napoleon. Washington's insight was that the British would never do that. The British did not have their existence at stake. America was a distant country, And it was not worth it for the British to deploy that kind of force. And so the British lost heart. A guerrilla war was enough to sort of scare the British away. And that's why the American Revolution was a success. The British could have won that war had they wanted to, just like Israel could completely level Gaza if it wanted to, but it didn't want to. Now, right after the founding generation, as America gained in stability and strength, it became really apparent that bad things were going on outside of America, but in the general vicinity of America. And that's why the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was necessary. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine was put into place by the latter part of the founding generation itself. And the Monroe Doctrine was, don't mess in my backyard. So this refers really to the continent of the Americas. So you begin to see American foreign policy shifting, not because Madison and Jefferson and Monroe did not agree with Washington, but because the circumstances were different. They recognized, hey, I'm no longer the 2-year-old on the playground. I'm now a 7-year-old, and there are other 6 and 7-year-old kids, and there are a few bullies around who would like to come around into my neighborhood, and I need to figure out ways to block them. So you see America maturing, if you will, and applying the Machiavellian analysis to the new situation. Now, it's hard to disagree that after World War II, America finds itself, some people may think this is a curse, I don't, in the position of being the strongest power in the world. And we have remained that for the past 70 years. We can pretend that that's not the case, but it is the case. But sometimes being the strongest power in the world motivates strong enemies. It was obviously the Soviet Union. We won the Cold War. That was a good thing, in my opinion. And now we see the primary enemy of America, radical Islam. It's not because we sought this enemy. It's not because we singled them out. That this is a force that arose out of the Middle East, making that region critical because it is the launching pad for the hostility and the attacks on us. So it seems to me we have to take stock of our realistic situation now. And the principles of Washington remain valid, but the application, in my view, is different. So I support kind of a Reaganite foreign policy that is very cautious in the use of force. I don't support the use of military deployment in Israel. So I'm not suggesting any kind of a blank check or unlimited support for Israel. I'm saying Israel is 5% of our foreign aid budget. We give $3.8 billion to Israel. I'm not even wedded to that amount, but it seems to me we get a lot for that. By the way, most of that money goes to our own defense contractors, and the defense contractors basically produce military equipment, which then goes to Israel. But for someone to suggest that like that paltry sum by the standards of the kind of money that our government spends, I mean, we spend that kind of money on 1 or 2 agencies that basically have bureaucrats that sit around twiddling their thumbs and doing absolutely nothing. In this case, we're getting a lot of value for that money. And so, look, it's a prudential call at the end of the day. But just as I think, by and large, that we have other allies in the world, they're not permanent allies, but there are allies now in this situation. Japan and India are important to us because China has become so powerful. When China was a sleepy country that was basically a third world country with just a large geography, it's not so important for us to have those allies. Maybe a day will come when the Islamic countries all settle down, radical Islam is defeated by moderate or traditional Muslims in their own region. I don't see this happening. I think they're actually gaining traction. But if it did happen, you could then say, well, look, there's no reason for us to be hostile to Israel, but there's nothing they're really doing for us over there. But I don't think you can reasonably say that now.
That's interesting. So it seems like for both of you, the principle is there that in theory, if it were to benefit America, you're open to supporting any ally. I mean, you're obviously saying that, Dinesh. Would you agree with that in principle, Auron?
Again, I want to be careful with supporting an ally in phrasing here, because, and I want to be clear here, I don't want to make arguments against things that Dinesh is not saying. So I want to just say here now, I'm going to address a wider feeling and not what Dinesh, not the discrete standing that Dinesh has put out here, like as his position. But to be clear, while Dinesh is making a very good practical case for why we support America, it should be noted that this is not the case that is made by the majority of Israeli proponents. The case we hear more and more is actually we are morally required to do this. We're biblically required to do this. This is not a practical application of our current interest that could end at any time. This is a religious devotion, right? And again, this is not Dinesh's position, so I'm not trying to attack him with it, but that is a reality in the sphere we need to understand. In the same way that I have to acknowledge that many of the people who are against Israel do it simply out of hatred of Israel, right? So we both have people on perhaps this, we find ourselves temporarily on their side, but would not agree with their position. But the case has to be pointed out that we do not have some temporary tactical alliance with Israel. We have a multi-decade religious devotion to Israel that has been perpetuated by our leadership class. And we can't, and again, I'm not assigning that to Dinesh, but we can't really address the standing we have with Israel until that's removed. Yes, if Israel was a temporary ally in a temporary operation, I would be fine with working with them on a specific mission, right? But this never-ending blank check, and as Dinesh pointed out, it's not a large sum of money in theory, but in practice, that's not true. It's not just the $3 billion. It's also the deployment of aircraft carriers. It's sending the missile defense systems. It's all the other things that we do that go on top of that can quickly double or triple that budget. And even then, it's not about the money, because if that money is not that important, well, Israel's a rich country. So why does it need $3 billion from the United States when it's an incredibly rich and competent country? And the only answer that really makes sense is it ties us permanently to them, so that if another country attacks them, or if they take an action that another country disagrees with, and there's some kind of reciprocity or some kind of reciprocal action against them, then all of a sudden you're actually dealing with the United States, not just Israel. And so I think that when we say, okay, if this is a temporary tactical alliance, we would be for it, I'd say, yes, that's true. However, the facts on the ground is actually what we have is a multi-decade religious devotion that is then also backed up by a practical fiscal tie that requires us to involve ourselves and requires every other nation to know that ultimately we're the ones backing what Israel is doing, if not entirely financially, through our geopolitical association with them. And I don't think that extended association is what George Washington would have wanted, because he said so.
Yeah, I see. So there's the fiscal side of the partnership, but then there's the question of it's what you're getting at is everything that comes with that fiscal partnership, or even beyond that, right? Which is influence. I mean, and that's the big question. So one question to pass over to you, Dinesh, would be, do you think there's any truth to the statement or the claim that Israel has too much influence on American politics or politicians or anything like that?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of speak to this head on, and I feel kind of qualified to speak to this because you have to realize I'm coming to this debate very much from the outside. I'm not a kind of professional Israel advocate. In fact, this is the first film I made about a topic like this. All my other films are about America and the meaning of America. So I'm squarely America first. I also want to emphasize, because a couple of people of late are posting this on social media. Well, Dinesh, how much is Israel paying you? I want to emphasize that my wife and I, for the past 3 years, have been giving large amounts of money to biblical archaeology in Israel. So we are actually paying Israel. They're not paying us. The balance is entirely in that direction. And we're doing it because I support the idea that seals and inscriptions and stones are coming out of the ground that are validating not just the Hebrew, but also the Christian scriptures. To me, this is an exciting prospect of God in a way. As the world becomes more secular, God is speaking back through the stones. Now, I want to talk about the biblical aspect, but maybe we can get to that because I want to hone in on the issue of Jewish influence. It seems to me that when I first came to America, and this was in 1978, in the latter part of the 20th century, the Jews in America had a overwhelming amount of influence on U.S. policy toward Israel. It's not entirely surprising because Jews, although small in number, are very powerful as a group. They're the most successful tribe in world history. And they've done it, by the way, not because of preferential treatment, nepotism, DEI. They've done it because they're smart. They work really hard. They've built up this influence in the society, right? So when you have American Jews who have that kind of influence, they're going to exercise it. We should expect it. By the way, from the founding all the way till the 20th century, Episcopalians as a group had massive amounts of influence. Why? Because they were just quite simply the dominant financial, political, and cultural group in the society. Now, I would suggest that that has all changed. And you can see it in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party used to be strongly pro-Israel. The Democratic Party had a lot of Jewish congressmen and senators, and I'm not saying it was exclusively them, but nevertheless, the pro-Israel faction banded together, and the Democratic Party was like, yes, Israel all the way. But you notice that the Jews have not been able to hold the Democratic Party. Why? Today, the Democratic Party would much rather bow to the Ilhan Omars of the world. They would much rather bow there. Look at Mamdani and the advances of Mamdani in New York. Mamdani is the combination of the cultural left plus radical Islam, and he's doing just fine in New York City. So if the Jews were all that powerful, they would have shut him down long ago. You wouldn't have the Squad. You wouldn't even have an anti-Israel faction in the Democratic Party. And I would argue it's no longer a faction. It's now the dominant force. The Republican Party, by contrast, is pro-Israel, but it's not because the Jews are helping us. The Jews are not helping us. They don't vote for us. They don't give us a ton of money. The reason for the Republican Party's support of Israel is, in fact, ideological, and most of that ideological support is coming from evangelical Christians who are drawing on biblical arguments and reasons for that support. So I think this is a fair picture of the complex reality. To say that like the Jews have too much influence, you can debate it. I think successful tribes generally have more influence than unsuccessful tribes. But I would suggest that because of their sheer numbers, which is the Muslims are now, 2.2 billion in the world. They've got a tremendous amount of oil money. The influence of Israel is more than countered by the influence and money of Qatar. So the Muslims are investing a tremendous amount of resources, financial, political, organizational, in this country. And so to speak unilaterally about like the Jews have too much power kind of misses this big picture.
Okay, that's great. I'm gonna basically have the same question over to you, Auron, and I'll ask you the question. Do you believe that Israel and Jewish influence is actually a problem in American politics? But before I do, I'm going to have us go to one of our sponsors for the episode. So thank you guys for anyone who's watching. If you like what I'm doing, if you like what we're doing over here, go over to our sponsors, patronize them. They're awesome. And in particular, Mount Athos, because they're the best. Here you go.
In 1 Timothy 4:8, the Apostle Paul tells us that physical training is indeed valuable for the Christian life. And while physical fitness is not the most important thing in the Christian life, it is still of great importance, particularly for men. Why? Because God has called you to protect and to provide. Men, you are called to be protectors. Therefore, God is calling you to be strong, spiritually, emotionally, and yes, even physically. Physical fitness is also important because God has called you to provide. Your family needs you to live a long, healthy life. So, get strong and stay fit with Mount Athos. They are a Christian fitness company that uses some of the best natural ingredients. So I've personally been using their supplements for 6 months now, and I'll tell you right now, I am not going back. They are my new supplement brand. So, stop giving your money to pagan fitness brands that can't even tell the difference between men and women. Join Mount Athos in creating the next generation of health, strength, and spiritual vitality. Visit athosperform.com/reformation. And don't forget to use code Reformation for an exclusive discount today.
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to you, Auron. It seems to me, Dinesh, that you're saying that yes, Israel has influence in our politics, but that's because they are, a high performance people, and so it would make sense that they have influence. Would that be a proper summary of how you would put it?
Well, let's be careful. It is true that foreign countries have lobbying operations, but that those should be distinguished from people in America who are pro-Israel for whatever reason. So I'm talking about American Jews. I'm talking about American evangelicals. So certainly in a participatory democracy, we get to say as citizens, we think it's good for America to do this. We think it's good for America to do that. I don't think that the Jews have a dual loyalty. I think they genuinely believe that for America to support Israel is good for Israel and good for America. And that is the way we have democratic debate in this country.
Excellent. Well, I'll pass it over to you, Auron. What is your position on Jewish influence or Israeli influence in America and in American politics?
Yeah, I think first we should separate Israeli and Jewish influence, because Israel is not Jews and Jews are not Israel. In fact, many Jews are secular and hate Israel and go out of their way to protest Israel. Some of the loudest voices in anti-Israel protesting are Jewish. So I think it's a mistake to conflate these two. So I'm less concerned about the influence that Jewish Americans have on America if they are American, because that's not a foreign nation. I have a problem with Israeli influence because it is a foreign nation and they should not have direct influence in our government. So there are a large number, like I said, of secular Jews, and they continue to vote for the Democratic Party. They don't, as Dinesh pointed out, they don't give money to Republicans. They don't vote Republican. Still 70% liberal, pretty much all the way down. The main problem that would exist for Jews having any influence in America would be if they advocated for an outside force. If they're not doing that, then that's not the issue. If you look at then Israeli influence, I think it's very clear that there is an undue amount of influence. It's very clear that even Donald Trump has said this pretty openly. Hey, you guys have a really powerful lobby in the United States, and you can bend a lot of people to your will. He said that, and he doesn't even say that as an attack. He I think ultimately really does love Israel, but like that's just an admission of the reality on the ground. So you don't really have to go to some weird conspiracy theory to ask, does Israel have a lot of influence in the United States? Because Donald Trump will just tell you the answer is yes. I also know this just personally. I mean, Dinesh has been doing this a lot longer than I have. I've only been doing this for about 3 years, but honestly, one of the first things that happened when I got a show on a major network is I got the call, like not from my network, but like I got the call from a lot of pro-Israel people who all of a sudden I had never heard of and who had never heard of me, but they're all very interested in my show and who I was going to have on a guest and what would my positions be and can I put their guests on to give their positions. And hey, just very influential people suddenly started contacting me and saying, here are the people you should be putting on your show, the positions you should have. And their concern was mainly centered around the state of Israel. I also get about 1,000 emails a day from different pro-Israel groups. Now, is there anything ultimately wrong with Israel as a country fighting for its own interests? No, but I've never gotten an email from Qatar, and no one's ever called me and said, here are some issues you should probably think about in the way that Qatar prefers. So the idea that there's just a similar level of influence is incorrect. Now, I don't think that Israel ultimately is a particularly insidious nation this way. I don't think it's like somehow unique in its desire to have influence on the imperial hegemon of the world. I think a lot of countries, as Dinesh pointed out, do want that. I'm sure Qatar is one of them among many. We have, unfortunately, too many foreign interests fighting constantly over control of our government. It's very clear that there is far too much foreign money. Many of our politicians are owned by places like China. And if they can be owned by China, I don't really understand why we would accept the idea that that is too much, but another country like Israel having that same level of influence is just fine. I think we just have all of these countries no longer having any level of influence. And I don't really take the idea, honestly, seriously, that like because AIPAC is made up of American citizens, it's fine, because obviously they do coordinate with the Israeli government. That much is very, very clear. Also, if I moved to Japan and I became a lobbyist in Japan, and all I did was argue for the well-being of America in Japan, and maybe moving more Americans in there, fighting wars on behalf of America, giving money to America, I think it would be pretty clear that even though I guess technically I have immigrated to Japan and maybe become a citizen in Japan, I'm not really operating in their interests, right? So if you're an Armenian and you're constantly lobbying for Armenian interests in the United States, then I'll just, I think it's fair to say, okay, perhaps you have some loyalty to both. And I can kind of understand that that's your homeland, that's your ancestry, those are your people. But that kind of says something, right? Like that means something. That again, I don't think that any of these things need to be demonized. It's not like, oh, this is something particular to Jewish people. No, we can see this in Ilhan Omar, saying, I'm actually here for Somalia and I'm here to serve the interests of the Somali community in the United States. When I worked for a Greek politician, he was constantly talking about what America could do for Cyprus or whatever they were fighting over with Turkey at the time. So like these like ghettoized ethnic interests, for better or for worse, are born, and I think entirely for worse, are bored into American politics at every level. It's not just Israel, but Israel is the most notable example. Everyone can kind of see that. It's not you don't need to be Inspector Gadget to figure that one out. So I just think it's best to acknowledge those realities and move forward, which I think Dinesh did largely. But I would just say that ultimately Qatar just clearly does not have that level of influence in the United States. And I know personally because, well, I haven't gotten any Qatar emails or calls, but I certainly have gotten Israeli emails and calls.
Well, can I jump in on this? Just
yeah,
briefly?
I'll just pass it over to you to respond to that. I think this is one of the cruxes of y'all's disagreement here, and so I'd like to hone in here, and we can get on to some of the biblical discussion as well. But let's hone in on this.
Well, first of all, I just want to say a word of commendation and praise for Auron here, because this debate is so different from what we often see on social media, which is stuff like, some Mossad agent may have crawled through a pipe and really shot Charlie Kirk, and it wasn't really the shooter, and it wasn't a trans network. It was really the state of Israel. This debate is being conducted at a completely different level, much more, I think, honest, and also getting to the heart of the matter. Now, Auron made 2 points, and the first one I agree with, and the second one I don't. Let's start with the point of agreement. He said that you have all these powerful entities in American politics, foreign countries, and they have too much influence. I would extend that point to say that we have a pharmaceutical industry that has too much influence and a food industry that has too much influence. And so our politicians are, to a much greater degree than either of us would like, bought and paid for by these constituencies. The motivations might be different, but there is a lot of, you could call it, special interest money circulating in American politics. Israel is part of that, but it's by no means the dominant part of that. And it's certainly by no means the only part of that. So if we're talking about the need as part of our American populism to move the balance away from well-heeled interests, foreign and domestic, and strengthen the power of the ordinary citizen to control his own local community, to have a greater say in the country, I could not be more on board with this project. Now, the second part of what Auron said, I don't agree with, because I think what he was saying is that he equally rejects the influence of enemies versus allies. And again, when I say enemies and allies, I'm not talking about forever enemies and forever allies. I'm talking about our enemies and allies now. So, for example, to me, it makes a difference if, for example, you have Great Britain lobbying for something, or even Germany, for all the complications regarding our relationship with Germany. Let's just say Germany is lobbying for a pipeline, or they're lobbying for Mercedes-Benz in America. I have a different view of that than I would have, for example, if Iran was lobbying for similar projects. Why? Because quite simply, part of being a realist is actually being able to tell the difference between the guys who are on your side, part of your team, and the guys who are out to kill you. You have to be able to make those kinds of distinctions. And finally, on the business of Qatar, look, the strategy of Qatar and Israel is completely different. And the strategy of Qatar is, and it's laid out, by the way, in a Muslim Brotherhood document of several years ago, it is sort of gradual penetration. So Qatar's strategy is not, in fact, to directly lobby a congressman, although they will do that. But it's to like endow a chair at Columbia University. It is to have Qatari allies run for the school board in a suburb in Texas. So Qatar is in some ways building influence at the most fundamental level from the ground up. And it's not really all that visible. I mean, think about it. I live in Texas, and suddenly in the red state of Texas, in places like Houston and Dallas, you just have a proliferation of mosques. And it's not that they came up overnight. We just noticed them overnight. And this is not all built with local Muslim money. This money often comes in through a kind of complicated network of nonprofits funded by foreign entities. And so Qatar has a lot of influence, but their strategy of accumulating that influence, I would argue, in some ways is more gradual, but in the long term, perhaps more insidious.
Yeah, in that vein, I've seen several interviews with different Muslims and ex-Muslims who have said that we fund left-wing organizations to facilitate the destruction of the West because we know that those radical left-wing causes ultimately destabilize and harm Western society. So that's interesting. I'll pass it over to you for a second, Auron. If you have any rebuttal to that, and I also want to get to the question before we get into the biblical side of things about Dinesh's claim that our response, I'm sorry, not our response, that Israel's response in Gaza is outsized. It's beyond the pale. And Dinesh, you drew an analogy to Pearl Harbor and how no one questioned America's response in Pearl Harbor. And so if you have anything to respond to what Dinesh just said, that go for that. And then beyond that, I'd like to hear your response to his initial claim that that people are upset with Israel in their response in Gaza, and yet they may be holding them to a double standard or something like that.
May I make just a brief second point and have Auron kind of take it all on as a broader issue?
Yeah.
Think of it this way. This to me is a model for thinking about it. If I'm sitting in my home, minding my own business, and a group of gangsters break my windows, kick my door in, they do a home invasion of me. This is basically October 7th. And they rape my wife, they killed some of my kids. And in desperation, I go grab my gun to fight back. The guy runs away, or the guys run away. They all jump into a van. And as I chase them down, they emerge from the van with their own wives and kids, whom they put in front of them. And they basically go, "Don't shoot. You can't shoot because you have a different set of moral standards than we do. These are civilians and you have no right to harm them at all. So don't even shoot at me because you might accidentally kill one of them. And therefore, you're to blame for these casualties." No, this is actually wrong. Who's to blame for those casualties? The guy who is pulling his own wife and his own kids and sticking them in front of him. So to me, the civilian casualties are a tragedy. They are a moral horror on both sides, but the moral responsibility for it falls not only on the perpetrators for starting it. That alone, they put their own kids in danger when they did that. But above and beyond that, they are explicitly yanking their own kids and putting them on the front lines and basically daring the Israelis to attack on the grounds that if you attack, it will foment a moral outrage in the world, and it will cause the media to turn against you and world opinion to turn against you and the UN to turn against you. So this is the strategic game that Hamas is playing. I think that they foresaw this script in the way it would play out. They knew Israel would strike back, and they knew that they could turn that strike back into a massive propaganda victory. And that is exactly what's happening now.
I'll pass it over to you to just respond to that, Auron.
Sure. So a couple things, since we kind of stacked a few issues on top of each other there. First, I want to return Dinesh's compliment. I appreciate him keeping this a very cordial and professional discussion, because it's very easy for people to just run out and say, anti-Semite, you must hate Israel, Nazi. That's the very first thing you hear, unfortunately, from a large number of people. who have kind of picked up this debate. So very glad that that is not where either of us are going on this. Second, I'll say very quickly on the issue of foreign influence. Dinesh said that our greatest enemy is radical Islam, and I think it is a generational enemy for Christianity itself. So I'm not going to disagree that they ultimately are not the enemies of Christian civilization. They are. But the greatest enemy actually is currently our own system. It's actually our own. All of the greatest threats to America currently are the American government or other entities inside of America that are manipulating our politics for ill. And you can tell this because the real problem with radical Islam is not that it exists somewhere in the Middle East. It's that we keep shipping it into the United States, which is insane, right? That's absolutely insane. Like, the reason there are mosques popping up in Texas isn't because of Qatar. Yeah, maybe they're sending the money. It's because we keep letting Muslims in here. So send them all back. If they're on a visa, send them home, ban Muslim immigration. That problem is solved. We don't have to be pro or anti-Israel to solve this problem. The problem is not Israel or Qatar or any other Middle Eastern nation. The problem is our own government, our own leaders, our own NGOs. These people have betrayed us. And so actually our greatest enemy has nothing to do with radical Islam. Radical Islam is a tool of our greatest enemy, which is the people who are currently destroying the United States. So to the question of the actual Israeli operation in here, a couple things. First, the Israel's response to Gaza is separate from Israel's invasion of several other nations simultaneously. They've gone to war, yes, with people in Gaza. They've also gone to war with several other countries, including a Syrian regime they just bragged about installing a few months ago. But all of those decisions ultimately should be Israel's to make. I don't really care. I don't care. Israel can fight 9 countries if it wants. It can do a counterinsurgency. I don't care as long as they just don't involve me, my money, my diplomatic currency, the reputation of my country in that. I don't want to ever care what Israel does. It's its own sovereign nation. And the only way it can maintain its sovereignty is to stop being attached to the United States. You know what I hear more from Israel nationalists than anyone else is we are really tired of having the U.S. involved in our politics. We don't want them handcuffing our response to Hamas or Hezbollah or whatever. It's like, great. We can both just agree on this. We're giving you money, we're giving you diplomatic cover, and that is tying your hands. If you could do what you want to do on yourself, you could solve this problem in 1 minute. Great. Let's cut those ties and let them do what they need to do. The question of what's happening in Gaza is I think pretty obvious, right? Like, you have two peoples who are fundamentally incompatible and always will be. And a lot of that has to do with history, religious hatred, ethnic blood feuds, the way that Israel came into being in the first place, which, we could debate if we want to, but I don't really think that's fundamentally helpful. Let's just say terrorism is not new to the Middle East or to Israel. But the point is ultimately what's got to happen there whenever you have two incompatible peoples is one of them has to go, right? Like, that's just, there was never going to be peace between Israel and Palestine. That was never going to happen. And I think that better than understanding this as like World War II or Pearl Harbor or anything, what we should really be seeing this as ultimately is Americans versus, the Indian tribes of the United States. At one point, you had to make a decision. Andrew Jackson had to say, okay, well, are you guys going to become part of the United States? Because the United States has created its own culture, its own understanding. And if you want to be part of the United States, then you kind of have to abandon all your tribal understandings of who you are, your former religions, your former alliances, and join us. And if you can't join America, then we need to move you outside of America, because the compatibility between Americans and Indian tribes that want to maintain their way of life and their territory simply is not working. And we moved the Indians out of the territory. You can like that, you cannot like that. That's the reality. And that's just what Israel's doing now. They got to a point where it's like, okay, we obviously cannot exist simultaneously. So either you can join us and become exactly like us. And many Indians did, to be clear. A lot of people just focus on the Trail of Tears, but of course, many Indians became just Americans. And that's why so many Americans have Native American ancestry. But ultimately, many chose not to, and they had to go. They had to be moved out because there's simply no way that these two people could exist simultaneously. I'm not going to judge Israel for taking the necessary actions there in the same way I'm not really going to judge the United States for taking it, but it's not our problem, right? In the same way that I don't think other countries kind of would want to involve themselves in ethnically cleansing Native Americans out of American territory. I don't think America needs to be involved itself in ethnically cleansing Palestinians out of that area. And to be clear, like the relocation of entire population by definition is ethnic cleansing. I'm not attacking Israel as like a genocidal nation. That's just the proper term for the removal of an ethnic group from a place. And so I just think that ultimately I'm not arguing pro or against any of the actions Israel is taking. I just don't want to be involved in them. So are they morally righteous? Are they morally abhorrent? It shouldn't be my problem. It should be Israel's problem. And many Israeli nationalists tell me that's what they want. And so I'm just listening to them. I think we should stop tying each other's actions to each other's interests and simply allow each nation to act in its own.
That's interesting. I mean, circulating just after, and it may have been before, but just after Charlie Kirk's assassination was him outlining a similar view that he believed that was going to happen ultimately, and that the incompatibility of the two peoples would lead to some kind of ethnic cleansing of some sort. Dinesh, I'd like to get into some of the biblical stuff because we'll get there. Actually, let me just pass it over to you. I'm sure you've got something to say about that.
Yeah, I agree emphatically with Auron that the problems of America primarily are internal and are domestic. They have to do with fiscal irresponsibility. They have to do with cultural erosion, the breakdown of the family, the fanaticism of the cultural left, almost a kind of assassination culture that's now developing in certain segments of the left. This is our primary problem. So to the degree that America first means looking inward, focusing on our own problems, I agree completely. But it is worth noting that part of our problem here is that our cultural left has made a bizarre and yet in some ways understandable alliance with radical Islam. This is one of the perhaps most surprising developments of our time. I talked about it in a book called The Enemy at Home as early as around 2006, 2007. That book caused a major scandal at the Hoover Institution because when I published it, the whole idea was the clash of civilizations. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And I go, no, basically we have a huge divide in this society. So there's no we. And the left in this country is going to sort of get into bed, make strange bedfellows with radical Islam. Now, what would a kind of LGBTQ leftist have in common with, let's say, a Hamas radical? On the surface, it seems nothing at all, because those two groups want completely different types of societies, and neither would exist comfortably in the other person's society. But you notice how these groups have not only gotten into bed together, but even their terrorism looks the same. I mean, the terrorism on behalf of Palestine. When Charlie Kirk was shot, let's be very clear what he was shot about, right? He's not going to be shot over his view of fiscal responsibility. Nobody's going to shoot Charlie Kirk over his view of tariffs. The issues that get you shot right now are basically two: Palestine and the trans issue. And right there you see the connection between radical Islam, that's the Palestine part of it, from the river to the sea. Those people are developing their own terrorist network. And on the other side, you have the LGBTQ, or at least it's trans frontier, and we've seen multiple terrorist incidents come out of that. So this is a reality of our domestic politics, and one that we need to be aware of. We can't just say, well, the Muslims have nothing to do with this, they're all over there. They are over here, and they are cooking things up along with the radical left, and they get funded by the same leftist organizations that bankroll the left across the board. You see this, for example, even on the campus. The same leftist foundations give money to LGBTQ, and they also give money to Free Palestine. And so ultimately, from the left's point of view, the radical Muslims are just another ethnic group. It's sort of like, we got the blacks over here, we got the gays, the Latinos, we got the feminists. Okay, come on, you radical Muslims, you're another ethnic group. And that is how democratic politics, by here I mean the politics of the Democratic Party, is configured right now in this country. So we do have to deal with it.
I'll pass it over to you if you have anything you want to respond to in what Dinesh just said, Auron.
I mean, I'll just mostly agree with what he said there. I agree that ultimately, ideologically, radical Islam makes no sense inside the leftist coalition. But of course, it makes perfect sense if you understand what the leftist coalition is, which is a coalition of people who want to dismantle America, and specifically the personage in the personage of white Christian heterosexual males. That's really what the left is. The left doesn't have any principles. They don't have any abstract moral understandings. All they care about, whether you're in or out of the coalition, the friend-enemy distinction, which is apparently now a controversial thing to recognize, that what decides whether you are in the friend coalition or not is whether you want to dismantle America, whether you hate America. Muslims do hate America by and large, and so they are just another way to dismantle the United States. However, the only difference between, I guess, me and Dinesh on this issue, where we largely agree, is I don't think we need Israel to address this problem. I think we need to crush the left to address this problem. Israel is really just 1,000 miles removed from any need to address this issue. The issue is all internal. It's all about crushing the domestic left. And yes, they are using radical Islam as a wedge, but if we just stop importing them, then it doesn't matter anymore. So, immigration control solves this problem in a way that an alliance with Israel never would. So again, we agree on 90% of that. I just think the solution has literally nothing to do with a country in the Middle East and everything to do with our own domestic political will.
It is worth noting very briefly that radical Islam, though, is penetrating our neighborhood. I don't just mean in America. Radical Muslims are very powerful in Mexico. What are they doing over there? Mexico is not for radical Muslims, but they're there. Radical Islam is spread into South America. There are Malays dealing with it in Argentina. It's powerful in Brazil. It's essentially taken over Venezuela. If you look at the parliament of Venezuela, think about this. You've got Iranians in the parliament. Iranian Muslims serve in the parliament of Venezuela. They know Venezuela has enriched uranium. They have nefarious objectives quite apart from Israel, and they're pursuing them pretty diligently. So I don't think Auron would disagree here as part of our foreign policy. Look, we have a State Department, we have a Defense Department, or a War Department, which I like better, for a good reason. We have to pay attention to threats that are brewing around the world, and radical Islam is on the move.
Yeah. So before we move on, I guess we can just have a quick little summary here. Auron, how would you? I'll go to you first, Auron. How would you summarize where you and Dinesh disagree on as it relates to issue? If you could just summarize, based on our discussion, based on what you know so far, how would you summarize your disagreement with Dinesh here?
Well, I think probably wisely we've avoided the theological point up to this point, so I'll just address the real politique, since that's really where we focus most of our thing here. I think the real difference is mostly that I think that we have already had an extended relationship with Israel, one that is gone on much longer and has, unfortunately, many motivations that George Washington himself warned us against. And so while I think both I and Dinesh could agree that, okay, here's a particular strike, a particular fight that we need to ally ourselves with temporarily with Israel to produce, we would both agree, yeah, let's do that. But for me, I would say, and then it's over. I don't want a lobbying organization. I don't want to be giving an extended amount of money to these guys. I don't want to be floating aircraft carriers in their waters constantly to ensure that their strikes are successful. I don't want to be sending them emergency rockets to defend themselves against whatever they're fighting against. The consequences of the decisions they've made. I want them to fight their own battles. Again, that's what I hear from Israeli nationalists, that they want to fight their own battles. I just want to give them what they want. I want us to be temporary allies whenever that's required. And otherwise, I don't really want to be interacting with the nation state of Israel, as where I think Dinesh believes that long term there is a benefit that outweighs the cost to an extended alliance. And ultimately, that's where he kind of places his support for Israel.
Dinesh, I'll let you respond to that real quick.
Yeah. In the era of the Cold War, America made multiple alliances because the Soviets were the primary enemy. We had nothing in common with Pinochet in Chile, but he was an anti-communist. He hated the Russians. He was a despot. But we're like, listen, you're a gangster, but you're our gangster. You're on our side in this fight. The moment the Soviet Union collapsed, our interest in, for example, propping up these dictators in South America because they were anti-communist disappeared. We stopped doing it. Now, our interest in Israel for the early part of my career, let's say 1980 to 2000, was primarily driven by our dependency on foreign oil. was driven by the fact that that's a very unstable region. Israel is an ally. We have to be involved over there because, quite frankly, we have a vital financial stake in that region. So that was the realpolitik of that. Ironically, it seems to me that our dependency on the oil is less. We have a tremendous amount of natural gas in this country. We don't actually need that oil all that much. But we have a new problem. And the new problem is that after the Cold War, radical Islam, starting with Iran, began to grow, metastasize, gain strength, gain confidence, and show that it can actually win again and again and again. The very idea that a bunch of ragtag Taliban guys could beat us in a country like Afghanistan is downright shocking. And yet, you have to admit that that is, in fact, what happened. The United States has not really won a war clear since World War II. So to me, in this environment of radical Islam, Israel is, in fact, a valued ally. Now, let's remember, when we say valued ally, very often it is America wagging the tail, if you will, or maybe my analogy is terrible. What I'm saying is it's America calling the shots. Look at Trump. He's like, I'm not going to allow Israel to annex Judea and Samaria. Now, would that be a meaningful statement if actually Israel was calling the shots? Then Trump would basically say, I'll do whatever Netanyahu wants. But I think Trump is the boss. He wants to be the boss, and he is the boss, and he's setting the limits. So American support for Israel is not only conditional, but we are getting with it the power to be able to direct Israel's actions to a degree. Now, I think what Auron is saying is stop doing it. We don't want that influence. Let them do their own thing. And I would argue in general, they are doing their own thing. Who do you think is going after Hamas if not Israel? Who do you think? Israel had every right to strike at Iran because Iran is the place where the October 7 attacks were planned and cooked up. Now, Israel did not have the power to blow up their nuclear facility. So what did Israel do? Basically, they did this. Hello, Mr. Trump. Can we borrow a B-52 for like one night, escorted by some fighter planes? Do you mind dropping a couple of hefty bombs on these guys? And then that's it. Send your B-52 home. Transaction accomplished. Look, it's not just Israel that's safer. Don't you feel safer? Doesn't Auron feel safer? Isn't the world safer and better off because Iran's nuclear facilities are crippled? And if it is, and remember, lots of people on the MAGA right oppose this. Tucker warned about World War III. Tucker said that there's going to be retaliation from Russia and from China. Tucker said, get ready for a wider war. None of this really happened. So Trump was vindicated. Israel was vindicated. But we should all be glad that that was the case because it's turned out for the better.
That's good. I think the only thing left to talk about is that first case that you were talking about is the biblical case, because I see it kind of spurking Auron, because I think there is something to, Auron, you brought up at the beginning, this sort of religious level devotion to Israel within American evangelicalism. And I think that really speaks to the level of influence. Well, the problem that, Auron, you have with the level of influence in American politics that the nation of Israel has, really, it can't be separated from this biblical religious commitment that a lot of American evangelicals have, particularly on the conservative side of things. So before we get there, let me give our last sponsor his shout out, and then we'll get into that for just a minute.
Proverbs 13:22 tells us that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Well, if you're anything like me, you want to be a good, godly man, a man who provides for his family, a man who wisely stewards the financial resources that God has given him. And man, is that hard to do in today's economy. Now, I have personally spoken with multiple financial advisors, and I want you guys to know that I am personally using Joe Garrissey and his team at Backwards Planning Financial. Maybe you thought like I have. I wish that I had started investing years ago for my family's financial future. Maybe then me and my family would be in a better financial position. Listen, it's never too late to start. Joe Garrissey with Backwards Planning Financial works hard to help families achieve their financial goals. He's a Christian who works with one of the largest and most trusted financial service companies in the world. Whether you have millions in assets or you're just now getting started investing, Joe Garrissey can help you reach your financial goals. Visit backwardsplanningfinancial.com or call Joe Garrissey at 615-767-2555.
All right, let's get into that kind of religious level devotion that you were talking about. You mentioned the biblical case. If you want to tease that out a little bit for my audience, and I'll preface it with this: it seems to me that part of the reason why the discussion has turned into kind of an inflection point on the right, at least part of it, is that less and less young people identify with dispensationalism, and dispensationalism really from millennials, it's starting to dilute, and then down to the Zoomers where they just have almost nothing to do with it, and that's just, it either wasn't taught to them, or they don't see the case for it, or for whatever reason, dispensationalism seems to be diluting in the generations, and so with that comes a diluting of that religious fervor, that religious commitment to the nation of Israel. And so I think that's part of what's kind of galvanizing this discussion on the right, where it used to be, it was kind of there's really no discussion. Like those are God's chosen people, and that's that. But now, as we saw, even with, I think the kind of iconic moment almost on Tucker with Ted Cruz, where it just took a couple of questions from Tucker to kind of undo his view on the people of Israel, the Jews as God's chosen people, and it really didn't look good. But Tucker is playing the role of many young people right now who are going, "What are you talking about? Wait, are they? Is that the same? Is the modern nation state of Israel the same as the Old Testament Jews?" These kind of things. And so first, I'll pass it over to you, Dinesh, to kind of tease out the biblical case a little more, and then I want to hear from you, Auron. And I may add in a little sprinkle here and there, but I want to hear from you guys on this. So Dinesh, I'll pass it over to you, and we'll finish with this segment of our discussion.
Sure. I'd like to approach this not through the lens of dispensationalism, which I know a little bit about, but not a lot about. I've seen theological tracts about the kind of unfolding of biblical prophecy, what's going to happen in the end times. My own view is to be a little resistant to all that, for the simple reason that I think the book of Revelation is deliberately veiled. It is highly mysterious, and perhaps with good reason. Maybe God didn't intend us to sort of make all these end of the world predictions and try to figure things out with too much Euclidean certainty. I want to go to the mainstream Christian position, which I will identify with, I think it was Pope Benedict or Pope John Paul II, who said, "It is the Holy Land for everybody, but it is the promised land to the Jews." Now, this is not some dispensationalist. We're talking here about the kind of oldest line of Christianity, looking at things in the broadest perspective. So let me drill down into that a little bit. I think that there is a confusion between the spiritual covenantal aspect of things and the historical and you could call it inheritance side of things. In other words, the heavenly side and the earthly side. So on the heavenly side, I agree. The new covenant supplants the old covenant. There is a new man on the scene, a Messiah, Jesus. I believe as a Christian, salvation is through Jesus. It's through Jesus alone. So in that sense, the Christians are spiritually the chosen people. But this does not mean that the Old Testament is canceled out. The New Testament incorporates the old. It doesn't replace it. See, in Islam, you have a doctrine of abrogation in which, like, the later verses of the Quran cancel out the earlier ones. But as far as I know, in mainstream Christianity, well, I mean, look at it this way. We wouldn't keep the Old Testament in the Bible at all if it was superseded, if it was abrogated, if it no longer mattered. The other thing I think that's critical is that God is giving the land to Abraham and his descendants in a very earthly sense, in the same sense that your parents may give you a piece of land when they die. They go, "Hey, Auron, here's a piece of land. Now, when you give land, it is always in perpetuity, or you've never given it at all, right? Imagine if I were to say to you, if I buy my house, it's my house forever. That land is mine. It's not conditional. And so if I give you a piece of land and say, listen, I'm going to give this to you as long as you behave yourself. If you ever do bad behavior, the land is coming back to me. The deal is off. Well, then I never gave it. It was never your land. It's a fake. You're at best a renter or a leaser, but you're not in fact an owner. So what I'm getting at is that the biblical grant of that, and by the way, it's a God-forsaken piece of land. It's not the best piece of land in the world. I would not have chosen it, but there it is. That's the piece of land, and God basically says to Abraham, I'm going to give it to you. I also want to emphasize a second point, and that is that even though the name Palestinian or Palestine and the name Philistine are the same name, and even though the Palestinians, so-called, are currently in Gaza, which is exactly the place that the Philistines were, it was called Philistia, but in the Bible, there are 5 cities in Philistia, and one of them named in the Bible is Gaza. The Philistines and the Palestinians are not the same people. The Philistines are Europeans. They were called the Sea Peoples, referring to the Mediterranean Sea. They came from places like Cyprus. So they occupied that land. And again, as I say, the Palestinians have taken their name for complex historical reasons, but the Philistines were not Semites. They were not Arabs. The Palestinians who are there now came from Jordan. They came from Syria. They came from the Arabian desert. They are supplanted Arabs now in the land of Israel. But I was talking to the son of Hamas, this guy, Mossab Hassan Youssef, and he made, I think, a very profound point. He goes, there's no such thing as Palestine. There never has been in terms of a Palestinian state. What you have is Palestinianism as an ideology. And it's the ideology of Arabs who happen to live inside of the state of Israel and have taken on this kind of anti-colonial ideology. An ideology, by the way, cooked up outside of the region. Yasser Arafat, who was the founder of the PLO, was an Egyptian. He was not a Palestinian. So it's almost like the trans phenomenon, right? I'm gonna transition to being a woman. I'm gonna identify as a woman. You have a bunch of Arabs who are identifying as Palestinians, even though there's really no such thing as a Palestinian. There is Palestinianism, and that's all there is.
Okay, there's a lot there. Auron, I'll give you a chance to respond to that. I've got a couple follow-up questions, but I want to see if there's anything there immediately that you want to respond to on the biblical side of things.
Sure. I'm not going to pretend to be a biblical scholar, of course, or a theologian. In fact, one of the first books I think that had me thinking about wider issues of Christianity was Dinesh's What's So Great About Christianity. I think I read that in high school. So I'm not going to sit here and lecture anyone about theology. I will just say this. I grew up Southern Baptist, still am. Dispensationalism is basically just the water you swim in, right? Like I was reading the Left Behind books and all that stuff. Kirk Cameron came to my church as a kid. These are all things that were deeply part of my upbringing. So I think a lot of Christians, as you say, generationally, are coming to an understanding that actually dispensationalism is a relatively new way to understand the Bible. It's a relatively novel understanding of theology. Covenantal theology is much more the historical understanding of the church. I'm not going to argue. I have my own position, but again, I'm not a scholar, so I'm not going to go into which one of these is ultimately accurate. I think it is covenantal theology. But the fact that dispensationalism does have such a really deep hold on the American imagination, especially American Christian imagination, is pretty critical. As you say, we saw what kind of Ted Cruz said on the Tucker Carlson show, and that's just not a great look for someone who's supposed to be representing the United States first and foremost. Dinesh has made the argument, I think that's the argument to make one way or another, that Israel is or is not an ally worth our time, right? But the argument that we must support Israel biblically, while that's not what Dinesh is saying, I think in the Realpolitik, that is a big part of our support for Israel. I think it's actually the dominant part of our support for Israel. And in a way, Dinesh already made my whole argument for me when he said, the Jews in America don't actually vote for Republicans, they don't donate, they don't do anything. In fact, they're usually very anti-conservative, and yet we support Israel anyway. And he said the reason we do that is entirely ideological. And I agree. And I think that's a problem. I think if we're fighting for our nation as a nation and we're saying we're America first and we believe in real politics and all this stuff, then we should, if we support Israel at all, it should be entirely for our own interests. And yet, even in Dinesh's own explanation, he says actually our primary interest is not our own, which is why we've eschewed our own interest and ignored the fact that Jews don't support the Republican Party or conservatives. Instead, we support it just directly out of ideology. So here, that means the ideology has to actually be the issue. In the end of the day, it's not the real politique, it is the ideology. And in that sense, I think it's a huge problem. Because remember, when we're talking about Israel, we're muddling together three different things, right? Judaism is both an ethnicity and a religion. And then Israel is also a secular government. It's actually its own modern nation state. So is the current modern nation state government, as it's currently instantiated, is that the biblical Israel? Is that what we're loyal to? I think Dinesh and I could probably say no on that one. I feel safe in asserting that's the case. So then the question is, who has the claim? Is it the genetic claim to the land? Is it the ethnos of the Jews that has this control, or is it the religion? Is it those that adhere to the religion that ultimately have the claim? And if the religion is the one that makes the claim, well, I would say that given the fact that we are neither Jew nor Gentile anymore, I don't think there is a legitimate Jewish religion anymore because Christ has come and Judaism is no longer a path to worshiping God. It is a rejection of Christ at this point. Therefore, if we're going to say that Israel has the religion has a claim to the land, well, I think that it just means Christians have a claim to land because the church is Israel now. So the only thing I think left is that the idea that there's some genetic, literal, like blood and soil in the most radical sense, idea that is somehow perpetually given to the Israelites. And I'm less sure about that if for only the fact that many Israelites don't have that genetic heritage. And if we are going on genetic heritage, aren't we just like doing Nazi blood tests to figure out who claims the land? It all just seems a very bad basis on which to apportion our geopolitical might, I guess.
Before you respond to that, I just want to sprinkle on a controlling text of Scripture because I think it's really important. Because you mentioned the promise, the land promise, and Romans 9 for me was pretty key to debunking the dispensational understanding of covenant promises that were made to Abraham and how they apply today. So Romans 9, Paul is talking about Israel. He says, they are the Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law. To them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all. So he's lamenting the fact that they haven't come to Christ. He's saying, I would be cut off for them if I could. And then it goes on in verse 6, and this is key. He says, but it is not as though the word of God has failed because the Jews have not come to Christ. The word of God has not failed. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all who are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac and through your offspring shall be named. This means that it is not children of the flesh who are the children of God, but children of the promise are counted as offspring. And so that gets to what you were just talking about, Auron, how even within Israel, they were not all true Israel, right? It was those who put their faith in salvation has always been by grace through faith. And so now in the new covenant era, and Dinesh, you were getting at this as well, now it's Jew and Gentile. And so Paul says there, it's not as though the promise has failed, right? About the land or the promises in the Old Testament. It's not as though those promises have failed. In fact, they're fulfilled in Christ and given to God's chosen people, which is Jew and Gentile grafted in together. And so there's the promise element, but then there's the punishment element, which in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says that essentially your punishment for rejecting the Messiah, this temple that you guys love so much is going to be torn down in one generation, in 40 years. And we saw that come to fruition in 70 AD. And so that was the destruction in many ways of the entire Jewish religion, right? They can't even do their sacrifices anymore. It was all destroyed because the true sacrifice had come. And now many Jews, some people estimated even like a third of Jews came to Christ, but the majority rejected. And because of that rejection, they were dispersed as a diaspora because God's judgment had come, the Messiah had come. And so those two elements to me, I believe were fulfilled ultimately in Christ and in his people. So with that little sprinkle on, I want to pass the mic over to you, Dinesh, to respond to any of that, to Auron's claims or even some of the biblical theology claim.
I mean, there's so much there. I'm trying to figure out how to kind of get into it. The passage that you read to me, if you just look at it afresh, you'll see that what it's really saying is that Christians are spiritual Israelites. In other words, we are engrafted into the old covenant. It's in no way a repudiation of that covenant. In fact, it's an extension of it. It's the idea, and by the way, this was a dispute between Paul and the apostles. Paul and the apostles had a kind of famous showdown in which the apostles, mainly Peter, but also others, were like, listen, you have to be Jewish. You can accept the Messiah, but you have to continue to do Passover. You have to continue to perform the Jewish rites. And basically, Paul argued no. Paul argued that if you accept Christ, that is going to be sufficient. You no longer need to follow the Jewish codes. And Paul kind of won that argument, and I think rightly so. But it's very important to realize what Paul was not saying. Paul was not saying that there's a repudiation, for example, of the Ten Commandments. In no way is Paul saying, hey, listen, we Christians are now kind of, we're free of all that stuff.
Amen.
Right. In
Yeah,
other words, we don't do the Sabbath per se, although we do Sunday as a kind of Sabbath. We don't do all the Jewish customs. We don't celebrate the Jewish holidays, but we do revere the Hebrew prophets. And we also recognize that what Christ is doing is, in a sense, interpreting his own mission very much in the light of what came before. Remember, the only Bible that Jesus had was the Old Testament. Jesus taught out of the Old Testament. The early Christians, some people think churches started in the 4th century when Constantine converted to Christianity. No, the first churches were actually synagogues. You have essentially the new Christians who saw themselves as Jews. They were the first, I could call them Judeo-Christians. And today I'll hear sometimes people say, well, there's no such thing as Judeo-Christian. Yes, actually there is. Historically, there was in fact this period, and it lasted for about 100 years, in which most of the early Christians were Jews who followed the Messiah. Even when Paul, if you follow Paul, who's the great apostle to the Gentiles, he goes to Smyrna, he goes to Asia Minor, he goes all these places. But where do you think he preaches? In synagogues. So in other words, Paul himself is a rabbi, as Jesus was a rabbi, but a rabbi following the new Messiah. So I think all of this is just kind of a way of saying that I think that while dispensationalism may have some issues, I don't think that the current reading of covenant theology is correct, because it involves too great a repudiation of the Old Testament. Whereas the Old Testament is incorporated. I remember this comes out of one of the church councils. Again, this is not like 19th century Protestantism or something. It is the New Testament is in the Old concealed. The Old Testament is in the New revealed. So right here, you see this intimate, inextricable, can't pull them apart connection between the Old Testament and the New. And in my view, that is mainstream Christianity. That's not dispensationalism. That's what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity.
I'll pass it over to you here in a second, Auron. But I will say, you kind of articulated a repudiation of dispensationalism a little bit in favor of covenant. So covenant theology really does see we would be more the whole Bible Christians. The covenant theology really posits that a continuity between Old and New Covenant with fulfillment in Christ. It's really interesting. So, man, I'll have to have you back on. We'll just have a theological discussion next time. That'd be fun. But I'll pass it over to Auron here and see if you have any response to the points that Dinesh just made.
No, I'm kind of with you. That was where I was going to go. Ultimately, I think what Dinesh is describing is just covenantal theology in a large degree. I think it's a misunderstanding to believe that this is somehow a rejection of the Old Testament or rejection of the Jewish roots of Christianity. But I think this is critical. there is no Judeo-Christianity. And I don't say this saying that obviously there were Jews who were Christians. They just stopped being Jews the minute they became Christian. And Paul was very clear about that, right? Like there is a difference. And we can tell the difference because actually Jews were working against Christianity. If you want to look at Julian the Apostate, he tries to rebuild the temple, right, to disprove Christianity. He doesn't like that the Roman Empire is starting to become Christian. He doesn't like this wave of Christianity moving through his society. So he attempts to rebuild this Jewish temple. He thinks that that's the way he'll disprove that Christ was Lord, and that betrays his prophecy. And ultimately then, if he allies himself with this goal of the Jewish people of rebuilding this temple, he can get rid of this scourge of Christianity inside his society. And it fails. And the amazing thing, this is a miracle we don't talk about enough at all. Even in secular histories, it talks about the miracles that occur to stop the rebuilding of the temple. Literally, fireballs erupt from the earth to stop the reconstruction of this temple, and eventually they abandon it. So I think it's just, it is of course factually true that the first Christians are Jewish, of Jewish descent, of heritage. It is of course true that Jesus is calling on the Jewish scriptures, because that is what exists at the time. He is the new word. He is the New Testament. He's pulling upon the old. We're not rejecting the Old Testament. We're rejecting the truths of the Bible. We're simply saying that those truths had to be completed, brought to completion under Christ, right? This does not mean that we reject the Jewish scriptures. It does, however, say that the Jewish scriptures are no longer by themselves a valid religion. They are no longer a valid way to God, that you need the completion of Christ. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the only way any of us, Jew or Gentile, is getting to God. And so we can no longer look at Judaism as its own complete, valid religion. It no longer is. Instead, we have the church, the new Israel, which is both Jew and Gentile. So this is not an attack on Jews or Judaism as it stood at that time, or Jews as they are today, but it is a recognition that that is no longer a valid religion, that is no longer a true religion, because it was incomplete. It was always incomplete, but it was as complete as religion could get at that time. Christ brought the fulfillment of that, and now that is the covenant under which we all live, Jew or Gentile. There is no difference here. There's no special promise to people who happen to at one point, read the Torah that we don't have as Christians. We are together, Jew and Gentile, the children of God. We are the unified church under Christ. And so there just is no longer some separate special promise for the non-Christian that does not belong to the children of God. And so that again, you guys will have far more, I'm sure, to say about the specifics of the theology. That is not my strength, but that is my understanding. And most importantly, again, I think the core debate here is whether or not, as Americans, we should care about Israel. We should be, committed to Israel, or we should somehow see Israel as like a special ally. And my argument again is just no. Like it's not true geopolitically, but also very importantly, it's not true religiously. And it is very clear that whether Dinesh holds to that particular, and it sounds like he doesn't, so great. I'm not attributing anything to him that he has not said, but it's clear that guys like Ted Cruz do believe this. And since they are incredibly influential and powerful in the United States, and this is an ideological commitment, as Dinesh said, that's what really matters at the end of the day. That's the real discussion I think ultimately we're having.
Well, let me say a word in defense of what I think Ted Cruz would say to this. And it's his position may be slightly different than mine, but I think it is an intelligent position. First of all, what he would say is that there's a difference between America's responsibilities as a country or a state and the responsibilities of individual Christians. So an individual Christian may say, my duty is to bless Israel. And that is different from what America as a country adopts as its foreign policy. If that difference is not so clear, think about the difference just by analogy of when Erica Kirk said, I forgive the guy who shot my husband, right? That is completely different from the position of the American state, which is that you can do that as an individual. That is in fact commanded by, you could say, Christian charity. But guess what? We're still going to convict him. We're still going to jail him. We're still going to execute him. In other words, the state's responsibilities remain what they are. And Christians can undertake sort of moral positions that they're taking as Christians, but that are distinguishable from, let's say, the precepts of American foreign policy. This is the critical point. I think the second point that Ted Cruz would say is this. Yes, Christ is the new temple. Christ himself said, the temple is my body. We're not talking about the old Solomonic temple or even the second temple that was built by King Herod. But Ted Cruz would say, but guess what? The Bible also makes certain forecasts about what things will happen in the last days or in the last age. The Bible predicts that the Jews will come back to their ancestral homeland. But the time that was said, it seemed astounding. It seemed unlikely in the extreme that this would occur. It seemed unlikely in the extreme even 50 years ago, or at least before the formation of the State of Israel. Sorry. And yet it happened, right? The Bible seems to suggest that one sign of the last days is going to be the rebuilding of the physical temple. Now, what does this have to do with us as Christians? Nothing. We have no spiritual stake in that at all. But guess what? If the Al-Aqsa Mosque comes down tomorrow and they rebuild the temple over there, I think you and I might have to start packing our bags, because that does appear to be a fairly clear biblical sign. Again, it's not about the new covenant. It's just about an attempt to decipher biblical prophecy in its most general contours or outlines. So I'm intrigued by all that. I don't think that those things can be known with certainty. I do think that the reconstitution of Israel, I mean, it is a kind of miracle. These people come back after 2,000 years. They revive their language. They eat the same food. They worship the same God. I mean, it's an astounding, just from a secular point of view, just to watch it and say, this has never happened to any other group of people in world history. So I am amazed at that, but I'm amazed at that not because I'm like, I have a stake in Israel. I'm amazed at that sort of from the point of view of the unfolding trajectory of biblical forecasting.
That's good. I really actually would, if you'd ever want to come back on just to have the theological discussion on this stuff. So I'll give a quick plug for this. I'm what's called post-millennial and a preterist. So I actually believe that the prophecies that you're referring to were given when they were referring to the future for the person giving them, but the past for us. So I actually believe that these most of these prophecies that people think are coming in the future actually were fulfilled in the first century. And in fact, and this is the fun thing about being post-mill is actually you believe that the world is going to get better and better and better, and ultimately not straight up, but like ultimately the world will be Christianized and Christ will return to a Christian world instead of kind of getting worse and worse and worse. That's a whole nother discussion. But if you ever want to come back on and have that discussion, that'd be really fun. But I have a video on that post-millennialism if you guys want to check that out on my channel. But Auron, I want to give you, we've got like just 5-6 more minutes left. If you have anything to respond to in that, I'd love to pass the mic over to you.
I mean, I'll just say this. I understand what Dinesh is saying, but honestly, I just disagree that that's what Ted Cruz would say, because it's just not what he said. And Ted Cruz, I think, was pretty clear about what he believed. So I'm just going to go with Ted Cruz's word on that. And again, I'm just going to hold what Dinesh said there about our ideological commitment to Israel being the real issue, because I think that's correct. As he said, that in the real politics sense, Jews do not vote for Republicans. They do not vote for conservatives. They do not donate to conservative causes. They do not support conservatives. The only reason we're doing this is because of an ideological commitment. I think that was just an accurate statement, and I think it's one that is worth recognizing. Ultimately, while there are practical arguments you can make about Israel being a worthwhile ally, and I can disagree with those or agree with them, I don't think that's what's motivating our relationship. I think what's motivating our relationship is this ideological adherence, despite whether it's good for conservatives, Republican Party, or America at large or not. And I also would say that, yes, there are, of course, a separation between the beliefs of the people, the individual commitments that one has, and the actions of the state. But also there isn't, right? Because I think we all just kind of discussed together here now some level of Christian nationalism, whether we would define ourselves that way or not, that we're all kind of agreeing to, which means that our beliefs about the Bible and our beliefs about our duty as Christians will reflect themselves in the policy of our nation. We want them to do that, actually. I think all of us want our commitments to God to be reflected in the law, to be reflected in our norms, to be reflected in our immigration policies, everything else, right? So I don't think it's so easy to just disproportionate. Yes, there is a role that for Erica Kirk to as a individual Christian make a decision for forgiveness. Though I think there's a larger debate. I'm certainly not going to Monday morning back a grieving widow about biblical forgiveness there at all. Either way, it's a great gesture of her magnanimity and her faith in Christ, even if it might, I think, not adhere to what Jesus himself said about how we should forgive each other. However, ultimately, that difference between her and the civil magistrate who should bring punishment is, yes, that is a correct understanding of Christian just behavior in general, that we should forgive the private enemy, but the civil magistrate still has the right to execute the public enemy, I think is a correct understanding. I don't think that really travels then onto our foreign policy. So I don't think that's the same thing. But yeah, just I guess wrapping it up to say, I think we can't necessarily, unfortunately, separate our Christian beliefs from our foreign policy. Actually, I don't think that's unfortunate. I think that's just true. And therefore, we have to recognize that the way we understand our Christian beliefs does impact our foreign policy, as I think has become a famous quote now at this point. All political differences are at base theological. And so I don't think we can just kind of throw that to the side and say, well, ultimately America will then have its own Machiavellian understanding. This is actually what Machiavelli gets wrong, that ultimately you cannot take effective politics and remove them from ideology or belief. These things are always interwoven. They will always interact. And so therefore it matters quite a bit what we believe ultimately about the nation state of Israel and its our biblical or not adherence or allegiance to it. Because if we have that incorrect, then we will then have our foreign policy incorrect at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's just self-evidently true that politics and culture is all downstream of theology and worship. And so getting this right is actually really important, getting the theology right, and because there are downstream effects. I'm going to pass it over to you, Dinesh, to have a last word. Go ahead.
Do I have a minute or two to sum up?
Yeah, sure.
Well, look, I do think that there is an evangelical camp that is very influential in the Republican Party that takes a very generic sort of spiritual position here, and that is we should support Israel. This is what Ted Cruz said. And when they think of Israel, they think about the people of Israel, and they also think about the nation of Israel. And let's remember also, Israel being a democratic society, you can't divorce the government of Netanyahu from the people of Israel, because the people of Israel picked that government. So that government is a legitimate representative of the people of Israel. It's not like Israel is run by some dictatorship where you can say, well, listen, I like the Jews in Israel, I like Israel, but I don't like the autocrat who's running the place. That is not the case here. Second of all, look at Trump. I mean, Trump's view, I think, on Israel is prudential, as it should be. He is in the position of the civil magistrate. So Trump is going to say, yeah, if Israel wants me to pulverize Soleimani, I think that's in our interest to do it. I'm going to do it. If Israel wants me to back him up on blowing up the Iranian nuclear facilities, I'm good with that. But let's say the Israelis tomorrow say, send 10,000 troops. We want to really help us finish the job in Gaza. I think Trump would say no, and rightly so. And in doing that, he is not stepping outside the Bible. He's not betraying the evangelicals. He is essentially taking what the evangelicals believe in poetry, and he's converting it into prose. And by prose, I mean the realpolitik of actual government, which is always governed by practical and prudential considerations. So in my view, you can have a sort of spiritual allegiance as individuals to Israel, but when you're in the seat of government, you got to look at the cold, hard facts. You got to look at the way the world is configured. You got to make decisions that are in the best interest of the United States of America.
I think I'm glad we ended there. It seems like we definitely have some disagreement here on the theology, on the first biblical side of things. But I think it seems to be your position, Dinesh, that we do have a disagreement there, and I think we all agree that that's important. But we also agree that if it's not in America's best interest, then we shouldn't do it. And I think that's an important place to land the plane. Auron, would you say anything else in that regard, or does that kind of track with you?
No, again, and I think this is why this debate is more productive than most of these are, because Dinesh and I share so much ground that the places that we differentiate, I think we can do in good faith, because we both know that ultimately the point is what's best for the United States. Dinesh might have a slightly different view of what interaction with Israel would be best for the United States than I do. And those, I think, divergences are important. But because we share this ultimate goal of what is best for the United States and putting America first, I think then we can, cover a lot more ground and make a lot more headway in this issue. So I think, as you said, that's a good place to kind of find final agreement, even if we continue to disagree on the best application of that. The most important ground there is what is best for America should be the guiding light in any relation with any country, and Israel is no different in that regard.
That's great. I think honestly, this conversation to me models the way forward. Like if we're gonna really make progress as conservatives, in building a movement that can reshape, that can defeat and crush the left and actually make progress in the way that we need to make progress, I think this is going to be the way to do it. So I appreciate both of you guys. I want to give you both a minute to plug anything you want to. Dinesh, I'll give it to you first, and then we'll end with you, Auron, and then we'll close things out.
Well, it so happens I have a film coming out in 10 days that is about all of this: the theological, the biblical, the archaeological, the Yahoo in the film. I have footage of October 7th that people have never seen. I'm right there in the archaeological pit pulling seals and stones out of the ground. So it's a fascinating project. I'm excited to share it with people. It's in theaters for a couple of days and then streaming and DVD. Go to the website, which is thedragonsprophecyfilm.com. So plural, thedragonsprophecyfilm.com, and check it out.
Awesome. And Auron, anything you want to plug or anything like that?
Sure. Just have the Auron MacIntyre show. It's of course on Blaze TV, but you can catch it on YouTube or Rumble. You can get it on all your favorite podcasts. And then of course, I've got my book, The Total State. It's about to go into its second printing. So new paperback will be coming out soon for people who'd like to pick that up, or there's still a few hard copies left if you want to get that before it goes to paperback.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to come on. This was really, really helpful for me. I really appreciate the time, guys, and hopefully it'll be a blessing to a lot of you guys out there who are watching. So my hope and prayer for you guys, as you all well know, is that everything that I do here at Reformation Red Pill would be used to equip you to build, defend, and expand the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. And with that, we'll see you guys on the next episode.